Well, good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Jordan. I'm the recycling coordinator at the Iowa City Landfill and Recycling Center. I work at the landfill, and we do composting on a large scale out there, so it's easy for me to talk about that, but it's great to have the experts for the small-scale composting and backyard composting come in and talk about that, as we have tonight with Sherlyn Flesher. Sherlyn has been a master gardener for over 10 years and is currently very active planting and maintaining the demonstration garden at the fairgrounds, so hopefully I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Her own gardens are filled with prairie plants and wildlife-friendly perennials. Sherlyn became interested in composting through a desire to reuse her own yard waste and has experimented with several ways to do that. For the last several years, Sherlyn has taught composting classes to new Master Gardener training classes and to the general public. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. My name's Sherlyn Flesher. Thanks for everybody for coming out tonight. I know it's a chore to be indoors when it's such a nice evening out. Such a nice time to do everything outdoors. I'm here to talk about home composting. As Jen said, I'm very interested in the topic just because I like to reuse my own yard waste as much as I can and send as little. I feel like it's a very valuable resource and I need to keep it where it is rather than sending it off to the landfill. I'm interested in nature, so I'm interested in the composting process, and that's really how I got into it. But I'm also stressed for time at most of the time, so I look for ways to do things more easily. So hopefully I'm going to talk about composting, both the easy part and the more technical and difficult parts. And at the end, we'll take some questions. If you do have a question during my presentation, please stop me. I'll answer as best I can. And I'm pretty good at repeating questions, so it should make it onto the microphone. Okay, composting. First of all, composting isn't a new thing. It's a very, very old thing. You can find references, apparently, to composting in very ancient tablets and texts from thousands of years ago. So it's really, we're just rediscovering in the modern world what has been going on for centuries and centuries and trying to mold it into what will fit into our modern environments. What I'm here tonight to do is to try to just tell you sort of the basic what is composting, why in the world do we want to do it, and how do we do it in the home landscape, and hopefully give you some ideas. Now, first of all, how many of you out there do composting of some kind in your own yards? So some experience, some no experience. So hopefully we'll give everybody some ideas about what to do. First of all, what is composting? Well, in nature, everything gets recycled. Water gets recycled as rain, which comes back down into the rivers and the streams. Rock gets broken down and recycled into soil. Plants fall in the ground and rot. Animals die and decay. Everything gets recycled. Composting is no more than taking that natural process and using it or molding it into our own. Composting is just the breakdown of organic material into the rich humus that we use in our soil. Natural process. All we're trying to do is harness that natural process, speed it up through design and maybe a little bit of effort, and then use it to our benefit. So in our gardens, to recycle our material and hopefully improve our gardens, improve our soils. Why do we want to do it? Well, maybe Jen has other statistics than this, but at least 50% of what we send to a landfill is organic material that might possibly be composted. And obviously for our society, our community, our planet, it's better if we don't have to enlarge our landfills more than we already are. So if we can keep some of that material where it was produced, obviously that is less that we have to put into the landfill. It's less that we have to use it's less energy we have to use transporting waste from one place to another. We keep it in the same place when we reuse it. So composting helps. It helps with the evolution of our waste can from large to small. And that's really what we want. That's the importance of compost and composting for our community and our planet. But obviously, we've all got much more selfish reasons to compost. And basically, those selfish reasons are the things that are going to help us, of course. And if there's, I guess, the first thing that I would like you to take away from this presentation is that we don't really grow plants. We all are gardeners, but we don't really grow plants. Soil grows plants. Because without the soil, the plants don't grow. It's nothing that we do, it's what the soil does that grows the plants. The best that we can do is grow soil. The better the soil, the richer the soil, the better the plants do. And there's an awful lot of research behind the fact that plants that are grown in richer soils are more resistant to disease, more resistant to attack from insects, more resistant to drought, the soils erode less, and on and on and on. So if we can grow our soil, the plants will follow. So just keep that in mind. So, like I said, why do composting? These selfish reasons. It's going to improve our soil, whether we're setting up a new garden, whether we're using the compost to top dress established beds to help things along, whether we're seeding a new lawn or renovating a lawn, compost can help with all of that to improve the soil. And ultimately aiding that plant growth because we're going to grow the soil that's going to grow the plants. And of course, saving money because compost, better soil means you have to spend less money on chemical fertilizers or amendments to soil. And that also is backed by a lot of research. A lot of research says that perennials planted in really good soil need almost no chemical fertilizers. Most perennials will need no chemical fertilizers. Lawns need less fertilizer if they get more compost. And of course, then it reduces our waste also. And ultimately the cost to us of sending things to the landfill. Any questions so far? Everybody's so quiet. Now, the second thing I'd like you to keep in mind and to take away from this is that composting is easy. It's a natural process. All we're trying to do is contain it and use it for our own purposes. All it takes is really just a pile of material that will break down, a little bit of moisture, a little bit of work maybe turning it to keep it aerated. And then, given that, no matter what you do, you'll probably end up with compost because compost is easy. It's naturally occurring. Now we'll talk about some of the ways you can maybe make it better, speed it up, use it, some imaginative ways to do composting, but ultimately it's very easy. Oops. So, what does it take to make compost? The recipe is also very easy. It takes organic material, anything that will break down, or organic material will break down, either in a pile, in a bin, in a hole. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the organic material consists of two general types for composting, what we call the carbon-rich or the nitrogen-rich types. Carbon-rich material tends to be brown and dry. It's dried leaves, it's wood, it's dried out plants. Nitrogen-rich materials tend to be green and they tend to be moister. They're like fresh grass clippings, your waste from your kitchen, your things like fresh manure, things like grass clippings, fresh weeds that you've just pulled. All the things that are green and sort of moist are considered nitrogen-rich. And for a good compost pile or good composting, it takes a mixture of those two things. Moisture, not much happens without some moisture. And then finally, the key element, the composting organisms, which there are two basic types. There are the ones you can't see, the bacteria and the fungi. And they really do the majority of the work for composting. Those little tiny critters that you can't see are the ones that actually break down all the material into what we end up with as compost in the garden. There are also other critters, like the worms and the beetles and the slugs. I brought in some compost today, and when I opened that lid, I noticed I've got a few critters in there that I brought with me. So they're in there. They don't do the majority of the work. They sort of do the finishing, some of the finishing work of composting. Most of the work of breaking material down is done by the bacteria. So that's the basic recipe for compost, and it's a simple recipe. As far as all those critters, there are a lot of them. I think the ones that I brought in are millipedes and a few sow bugs, which I don't know if they're on there or not. But again, it's the bacteria. No matter what you see, it's the bacteria and the fungi that do the most of the breaking down. Now, to speed up your composting, because you have this material, you want it to break down, you want to get it to the point where you can use it on your garden. To speed it up, there are several things you can do. Now, one of them is managing the carbon to nitrogen ratio. That is the ratio of green material to brown material. Ideally, the researchers tell us that ideally, the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in a compost pile should be 30-to-1 by weight, which I don't know what that means, that nobody's weighing their stuff before they put it into their compost pile, certainly not weighing the carbon and the nitrogen. But roughly that works out to, if you have about 6 inches of brown material, like dry leaves, then you should have about 2 inches, a 2-inch layer of 2 or 3 inch layer of green stuff, like green grass clippings or weeds or something like that. Now, not everybody has that. Because we tend to be composting what we have, not the ideal of the world. So just keep in mind that though this is the ideal, still, compost is going to happen regardless of whether you have the perfect ratio or not. This just is going to be the fastest way. But I happen to be a person who does not want to spend money making compost. It should be free. Some people will go out and buy alfalfa meal to put on their compost pile to get more green stuff into it, or buy an artificial activator to get things to speed up the process. I don't like to buy money. I don't even like to put water on it because city water, I have to pay for that. I don't like that. So it should be free. So just remember, whatever you have in your yard, it will compost. It's just if you have too much carbon stuff, too much brown stuff, it'll take a little bit longer. But there are some ways to speed that up too. Okay. So carbon to nitrogen ratio is one way. There are many, many resources in the world that will tell you what the ratios are, carbon and nitrogen in certain materials. I brought a couple of books just that are ones that the Master Gardeners have that we've used, Rodale's Book of Composting. Here's another book called Let It Rot. The libraries probably have these. They have pages of things listed and what the carbon and nitrogen ratios are, as long as a lot of other good information. And there's a lot, of course, on the internet on this information. So if you have a material and you're wondering if it's high carbon or high nitrogen, there are many, many places where you can look that up. So that's one thing, the carbon to nitrogen ratio. If that's right, that helps to speed up your composting process. Another thing that speeds things up is particle size. If you have just a big lump of wood and put it in your compost pile, it's going to take a long time to break down. If you break it up into smaller chunks, it's got more surface area, so the organisms, the bacteria and such, have more surface area to work on. It'll break down faster. That goes for chunks of wood, that goes for leaves, that goes for anything that you put in your compost. If you chop it into a smaller particle first, then it will break down faster. Just makes sense. So chop things up. I'm a great advocate of using my mower to mow things that don't usually get mowed, and chop them up to either put them on compost or use them otherwise. Another thing that helps, of course, is moisture. If things are too dry, if the compost is too dry, the bacteria don't work as well, aren't as active. So you want to try to keep your compost pile as moist as possible. If it's too wet, you'll get a bad odor out of it most likely, but if your compost is above ground, that's usually not a problem. It usually drains out pretty well. It's usually the dryness that's more of a problem with compost. So you can add water to it. Again, I'm not somebody who likes to do that. I just like to have my compost pile in a place where the rainwater is going to hit it well. So sometimes in the summertime, I take the lid off my compost bin just to let as much rainwater in as possible, keep it from drying out. But you could also use your hose and water it down, put a few buckets of water in it if you wanted to. Compost should be fairly moist. They always say you should be able to squeeze a handful of compost and get a drop of water out of it. Now, I have never been able to do that. Maybe my hands aren't strong enough, I'm not sure. That's pretty wet. But, the moister the better generally. It drains out pretty fast. Okay, then one of the other things that speeds up what's going on in the compost pile is oxygen. The bacteria that are doing most of the work out there use oxygen to do it. They're the best decomposers when they use oxygen. If things are too compact in the compost pile, and you starve them for oxygen, a different kind of bacteria will take over that are anaerobic. They don't use oxygen, but they tend to produce things that smell bad. So usually you want to have your compost pile, so even though you want it wet and you want it fairly dense, you want enough oxygen in there that the bacteria has something to work with, and that's one of the reasons we recommend, if you have time to do it, every once in a while you turn your compost pile to get a little bit of air in there to make sure there are no pockets where things are too compacted. Okay. Then the last thing that's probably, something that will make your compost decay faster is temperature. The most efficient decomposing bacteria operate at a temperature somewhere between 90 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, ideally, which is fairly warm. And at that temperature, you not only get the fastest composting, because that's the best bacteria to have working, but you also tend to kill all the weed seeds and most of the diseases that might have been introduced into your compost pile with whatever you put in there. So hot composting is nice. You don't want it to get too hot because the decomposers will die off. You'll kill them. If it's too cold, you'll still have a lot of decomposition going on, but it'll be a little bit more slower. What happens in a compost pile, just to give you an idea, is you make a big pile of stuff. What happens is the bacteria on the inside start to break things down, basically oxidizing it, producing heat. And it's in the center of the compost pile that most of the heat is produced. You can, if you like to measure the temperature in your compost pile, you can buy a temperature probe to stick into the pile to see what temperature it is. When that heat in the center goes up, then the bacteria really cooking stuff in there. But then after a few days of that happening, the temperature in the middle will start to actually decline. And what's happened at that point is that the bacteria have used up most of their fuel in the center of the pile. And that's another reason we recommend, if you have time, if you can do it, to occasionally go out and turn your compost pile, because that mixes up the pile, gets the more fuel into the center, and the center will start to heat up again. So again, by doing that, you can speed up the process. So ideally, hot compost, 90 to 140 degrees. Now, we don't all have time to do that. We don't all have the right temperature, the right carbon-nitrogen ratio to actually have that occur. But, so, basically, there are pros and cons. If you're going to try to get really hot, the most efficient, fastest composting, it's faster. The compost will finish faster because the material is breaking down faster. It's very efficient. It's going to kill diseases and weeds. But it's also more labor intensive. You're going to have to monitor it. You're going to have to go take the temperature. You're going to have to adjust the things that are in the pile if things aren't heating up fast enough. You're going to have to worry about the moisture. You're going to have to turn it more often. You may or may not have time to do that. On the other hand, you could be more like what I do, which you put what you have into the compost pile. You turn it when you have time to do that. And just knowing that at the end of the season, you'll get compost anyway. And usually I would say it takes about 2 to 3 months for me to have stuff go from raw material to compost. Okay. Any questions about that? About temperature?
Do you just put it on one pile, or you have like a couple piles you're adjusting, or just one pile?
The question is, do I have just one pile or multiples? I personally only have one compost bin that I just put stuff in and turn. I'll show you a couple examples a little bit further on of some other setups and I'll talk about how we use them. Anything else? Okay, and the big question, what to compost? Basically anything that's organic, almost anything that's organic can be composted. All of your kitchen and vegetable wastes. Obviously any plant from the yard, paper of almost any kind could be composted. Sawdust, hair. One of the ones that I do a lot that's on this list is any vacuum cleaner bag or anything that comes out of my vacuum cleaner bag, since a lot of it is pet hair anyway, goes into the compost. Cloth, cotton or wool, natural fiber kind of cloth could be composted, though my experience is that takes a while to do. Dryer lint is great because that's almost all cotton and other natural fibers and dust. Feathers. I have a personal experience with feathers I might get to a little bit later if we have time. All kinds of good stuff that you can compost. There are a few things shouldn't be put in your compost pile. First, meat, cheese, or fat, mainly because those things attract the wrong kinds of critters. Those are the kinds of things that are going to get you skunks or rats or other things. And plus, well, you know what rancid meat smells like. You don't particularly want that in your compost pile. I advise you dispose of that elsewhere. And then there are other things that you could compost, but you should be really careful about them. Diseased plant material. For instance, if you have a blight on your tomatoes, don't put those tomatoes into the compost and then use the compost on your tomato the next year. There's too much of a risk that you're just spreading the disease and keeping it around. Any plant that is a skin irritant, those irritants don't necessarily break down in the compost pile, so be careful with any of those. Any kinds of weed seeds. Some types of weed seeds are invasives. I do not compost garlic mustard. That does go to the landfill because I don't want to take a chance with those weed seeds. And there might be some others that you have in your environment that you might not want to spread around. Dog or cat manure, supposedly. I don't do this, but the word on it is that you can put that in your compost pile, but they recommend you not use the compost on anything that you're going to eat. So don't put it on your vegetable garden. So some people recommend if you're going to compost that, you do it in a separate compost bin so that you know what's in there and you put it on your perennials or your other flowers, your ornamentals, but not on your vegetables. Any questions about what you can and can't compost? Yes.
We juice a lot of citrus, juice and grapefruits and stuff. I just wondered if you get a lot of matter material from that. I wondered if we put that in, there's going to be too acidic, or you have to worry about that kind of thing.
The question is, if you have a lot of citrus, would it be too acidic in a compost pile? And I don't think so. I think that by the time it gets broken down by the organisms, that acidity is going to be pretty much gone. And we have such good soil in Iowa. I don't think you can add a lot of stuff like that to an Iowa soil and not really make it too acid for anything. Any other, yes? Eggshells, that's a good question, because eggshells are not exactly something that gets composted into crumbly earth. However, you can break up eggshells and put them in the compost. They add a little bit of calcium to the mix, which doesn't hurt anything. And that's what I do.
Will it smell like from egg yolk and
If it's, yeah, the question is about the smell of the eggs. And if it's just the eggshell, there's not enough left to make a bad smell. I've never had a problem with that. I compost all of my eggshells. Maybe if you eat really a lot of eggs, it would be a problem, but I don't think normally. Any other questions?
You mentioned other animal manure. How does that have to be treated? You don't use cat or dog, but they mention other animals.
The question's about other types of manure than cat or dog. In other words, the vegetarian kind of manure, horse manure, cow manure, sheep manure, goat, chicken. Animals that are vegetarians, go ahead and put that in your compost pile. It's terrific. It actually acts as what they call an activator. It's high in nitrogen, and plus it's got a lot of organisms in it. So it actually speeds up your composting. We had an experience just out at the fairgrounds a couple weeks ago. The circus was in town, and we got some elephant dung. We were very excited. We are probably the only people in Iowa City, Johnson County, that has elephant dung in their compost. So, there you go. Anything else? Okay, so you collect your composting materials. Collect it however you want. In this kitchen, it's a colander on top of the countertop with newspaper lining it. When it's full, they take it out, put newspaper and all into the compost. Yes?
You had mentioned that the junk mail
Mhm.
and newspaper can be composted. What about the inks and the dyes?
That's a good question. The question's about the inks and the dyes in newspaper and other kinds of mail. Most of the dyes now are vegetable-based. There's still a recommendation you not use shiny kinds of supplements from the newspaper or make shiny magazine kinds of things, but most of the normal paper dyes, from what I understand, are vegetable-based and you can use them, and they shouldn't be a problem. So you can collect your material however you want to. You can go as far as collecting your paper, like things like paper towels and Kleenex break down really well in a compost pile because they're so porous. So you can collect those maybe right next to your trash can and take those out to your compost pile, or collect what, do as much or as little as is appropriate for you. Now, we're going to talk about the methods of composting. And probably the other thing I'd like you to take away from this is that there are lots of different ways to do composting. Lots of different methods. Choose the one or more than one that works for you. It doesn't have to be a bin. There are other ways. You can do an open pile. This may not be socially acceptable in your neighborhood. It just depends. But you can just make a big pile of stuff and leave it there, and it will eventually break down. You can dig a hole and put your compost into it, or put your vegetable matter into it and cover it up, and it will compost in the ground. And I've done that. Last fall when I cleaned off my annual bed, when I cleaned everything off, I dug a big hole. I put everything that I had that I'd cleaned off into the hole. I covered it up and left it there all winter. And it all broke down over the winter. It was wonderful. So now I have, a nice little spot in my vegetable bed, my annual bed that has very nice soil in it now this spring. You can do a trench. This is sort of depicting a three trench system or three path system, where one year you dig a trench and you put all your compost in it, you plant in another path, and you walk in a third path. The next year, where the compost was the first year, you plant the vegetables. Where the walking path was the first year, you dig a new trench and start putting vegetable matter into it. And in the place where the plants were growing last year, you make that your walking path. sort of a traditional garden way of doing compost in a trench. There's also what's called sheet composting. And I'm going to show you a couple slides here. These are from the home of Bonnie Penno, who is a master gardener. Last fall, she decided she wanted to increase the size of her perennial bed. So she did sheet composting. First she put down, as you can see on the lower right there, she had upper left, she had a blank space she wanted to put a new bed in. Lower left, first thing she did was put down a layer of cardboard. Organic, will break down. Also will kill off the grass that's underneath it because it's thick enough. You could also use 6 to 10 sheets of newspaper to do the same thing. She did that. Then she started layering stuff. She layered some straw, a brown material. So she had lots of high carbon stuff there to start with. And because she had that, she then, from another master gardener, got some horse manure, put that on top because that's high nitrogen, and would start the breakdown process. Kept layering. She put on some grass clippings and some other green stuff that she had. Even put on a layer of shredded paper from her paper shredder. Kept layering. Kept just adding whatever she had. And eventually got it to about 30 or so inches high. And then winter came, and basically this lasagna got to cook all winter long. Okay. Then this spring, tilled it up with her tiller, got nice black earth out of that. And you can see on the bottom right, she did plant some daylilies and some other things. I'm not sure what else is there, daylilies and something. And I don't have a more recent picture than this. This is about a month ago. But I expect that this time next year, this will be a beautiful bed, and I'll have a brand new slide for this. So, there are lots of ways to compost. And then, of course, you can do bins. And I understand there's a bin sale coming up. I don't know exactly what those bins look like, but they're a black plastic bin, I assume. So that's a good way to do it, but there are lots of kinds of bins. The ideal bin for home composting is at least 3 by 3 by 3. That seems to be a good size for getting the right amount of material so you get the right amount of heat buildup in the middle, but it's not so much that it's hard to manage. They can be easy, they can be complicated. You can have a unit that has a crank on it that you can turn. You can also do vermicomposting. I'm not really going to cover vermicomposting, which is composting with worms, which you can do in your home, in your basement, in your patio, wherever. Though there are many good books on that also. Compost units, like I said, come in all shapes, sizes. You can make them out of fencing, brick. There's a turning unit on the lower right there, which would have a crank on it. Makes the turning of the compost easy. You can spend a lot of money or a little money, whatever you need. The 3-bin model at the bottom is one that we have at the fairground. Oh, I'm not to that slide yet, but okay. Here's another Master Gardener's compost bin. One that he built with just some, boards and some hardware cloth on the sides. And this is in the fall. It's about full. Here it is in the spring, where it's broken down. He's put some more stuff on the top. It's about ready to be turned for this spring. Then here's the 3-bin compost system we have at the fairgrounds. This picture was taken late last year, and the morning glories had totally taken over the place. But we basically have 3 bins, and the way that we use that is we fill up a bin with stuff, and then we start turning that one full bin into a second bin, return it into the first bin. So we just sort of go back and forth, turning the material that was just in that one bin back and forth. Then any new material goes in the 3rd bin. So we're actively turning the 2 bins and not the 3rd one. And that gets everything sort of going in that bin that is being turned. But it's a nice system. I recommend that you go out to the demo garden and check it out during the fair, or just if you happen to be at the fairgrounds. because we always have a really nice demo garden, and you can check out the compost bins and the elephant dung. Okay, when is your compost ready? After you have it in a bin, you've been turning it. Well, you know it's ready when it's black and crumbly. And I did bring a container of compost if you don't know exactly what it looks like. I've got it sitting up here with the lid on it because I brought a few critters with me. I don't want them to get out into the library. So after the session is over, you're welcome to come up and look at that. But compost looks like rich, crumbly earth. It smells earthy, really good. And for the most part, you can't really see the organic material that it came from anymore. It just looks like crumbly earth. Most of the time when you harvest compost, you screen it because not everything will break down at the same rate. So you screen out the big particles and throw those back into the big compost pile. For instance, here's that same compost bin. He's harvested some compost and has a screen over his wheelbarrow thing. There are all kinds of screens. Here's another one. This one's a commercially purchased one from like Gardener's Supply magazine catalog or something. So you can buy them. You can make them. For a long time, my screen was just a piece of hardware cloth over a flower pot, and that was it. The simplest kind. I'm now using it's an aluminum basket from an old chest freezer, because it has handles on it. Works really well. I had to line it with hardware cloth. But again, it's whatever works for you. You can make one, you can buy one. But that helps you screen the material down so that you get the big chunks out of your compost when you're harvesting it. And so you end up with lots of nice compost, and it looks nice and crumbly and beautiful. And now that you have it, what do you do with it? Well, you can use it as a mulch or top dressing, amend the soil. You can use it to put into holes when you're planting. About anything, you can make rings around your perennials and just make a ring of compost around there. You can use it in planters. I use some compost in every outdoor planter that I make. You can use it to rejuvenate your lawn. It's really great if you do a core aeration and then put compost over that so that it goes into the little holes left by the aeration. Helps the lawns a lot. You can use it in the seeding of new lawns. Here's someone who is spreading compost over their garden in the fall. You can also very finely screen compost and use it to start seedlings indoors. Now, I haven't done this because I don't usually have compost in March when I'm doing seedlings, but if you are doing that, there's some research that says that if you do start your seedlings in a compost-rich material, that you have less damping off and less disease problems, and of course they grow really well. Okay. We always get a question about compost tea. Does anybody make compost tea out there? Okay, compost tea is basically something you can make out of compost and water. This recipe for compost tea is sort of the more complicated recipe because you use dechlorinated water and put a fish tank aerator and your water into a 5-gallon bucket with some compost in a nylon stocking and let it cook for a while, for a few days. The aerator, by adding oxygen to the water, helps the bacteria that are in the compost take over in the water. You then use that compost tea after a few days to either water your plants or to even spray on plants. There's a lot of evidence that helps prevent diseases and helps plants if you just spray it on the leaves of plants. Now, if you like less complicated compost tea, you can just take a bucket and any water that you have and a shovel full of compost and put it in there and stir it up every once in a while. And after 3 to 5 days, you'll have a decent compost tea that you can use also. So again, easy to difficult depending on how much time you have and what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so we're about to the end here. Basically, composting is easy. All you need is a pile of material, a little bit of moisture. If you've got time, turn it for aeration. Doesn't necessarily take a lot of expensive equipment. I mean, you'll probably need a pitchfork to turn with. You'll need probably some kind of screen to sift it out. A thermometer if you're really going to get into hot composting. Maybe a pail for the kitchen or the garage. Maybe some gloves or mask if you're sensitive to dust and things. Goggles if you're worried about stuff getting into your eyes. And a bin if you need a bin. You don't have to have a bin because there are lots of other ways to do it. So, you can choose a site, collect your waste, whatever kind it is, and get started. Your compost is going to enrich your garden, hopefully give you excellent produce. So, just to summarize, I just wanted you all to remember composting is easy. It's good for the environment, it's good for you, and it should give you a very bountiful harvest. Are there any questions? Yes.
Our garden is located, because we don't have a whole lot of choice, but we have a lot of large old black walnuts around, and if we put a compost bin, it's going to end up in there no matter what, because it goes everywhere. And we know that does affect, planting, but it does break down like everything else too. And we just have to, we have a different kind of compost as a result of it.
So you're putting, the questions about black walnut trees, you're putting the black walnut wood in or leaves into the
It's gonna
compost?
go in there no matter what, either with a compost pile.
Okay.
It like goes into the garden, you can't do much about it, or try to pick it out, but it still, yeah, it continues to, they're big old trees, they're gonna continue to come down, but,
Mm-hmm.
so, what kind of limitations do we have, do you have any idea what kind of limitations we have with that?
Okay, the questions about black walnut, and we'll probably after the session want to look this up and see if there's anything in any of these books. But that substance that's produced by black walnuts, which I believe is called juglone or something like that, is usually inhibits the growth of things like tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, all of the things in that family. So that kind of compost, if you're concerned it's got a lot of that in there, probably would not be good to use on a vegetable garden. I'm not sure how many perennials are really affected by that. That's something that would take some more research on that. Does that answer the question, sort of, as best I can? Any other questions? Yeah.
So, a really dumb question. If I start composting, because we do compost now, and it'll take a while for me to collect a pile, right? And then it will take a while for it to disintegrate
Mhm.
or cook. You said that maybe 2-3 months. So then is it at the fall a good time to put it on the beds, just as good a time as to put it on the beds in the spring, or?
The question is, if you're starting a compost pile now, and it's going to take until fall to get finished compost, is fall a good time to put it on the beds? And yes, about any time is a good time to put it on the beds. If you're working it in the fall, then your beds will be ready in the spring. You could also just leave your pile until spring. Not much happens in a compost pile in our cold winters. And harvest it in the spring and put it on then. It's sort of whatever is convenient for you. I don't think you can go wrong either way.
Just another question then, so during the winter, when you have a lot of scraps and things like that, do you still add them, put them through the snow, or what do you do with your?
The question is, do you still add scraps to your compost pile in the wintertime? I do. So I keep a bucket in the garage, and when my bucket in the garage gets full, I trudge out to the compost pile. Some people would say, okay, it's winter, it's too cold, I'm not going to do that in the wintertime. It's up to you, but you certainly can. Not much happens in the winter. A little bit will if your compost pile is big enough so that the center stays fairly warm, and maybe if it's out in the sun, maybe you get some warm days, you might get some composting going on It just depends on the environment. Is there another question?
Yeah, I had a question. I started a pile like a year ago, and I threw it a lot. I have a family, so I have a lot of orange peels, things that were kind of thick, and I wasn't chopping things up. So since I was lazy and I threw in a lot of big chunks, I mean, I know you said there were all those other factors. Should I be seeing some decay by now, or did I do something really wrong?
The question is, if you put in a lot of orange peels and didn't chop them up, should you be seeing some decay by now? I would say should be seeing some decay unless your pile is too dry.
It's really wet.
It's really wet.
Too wet.
The pile is really wet, and
I have a lot of waste from the kitchen there, cantaloupes, rye, I mean, just lots of really banana peels, things like that, lots of that kind of stuff.
Okay. Okay, the question is, should those kitchen things be breaking down fast? Some things break down faster than others. Banana peels usually break down pretty fast. Rinds, I usually try to cut those up into chunks because they're tough. Corn stalks and corn cobs, if you have those take a long time to break down. Melon rinds, watermelon seems to break down pretty fast. Cantaloupe's a little less fast. It's a little harder on the outside. But yeah, you should see things breaking down because usually vegetable scraps are high nitrogen and they usually break down fairly fast. Okay?
I knew about the dryer vent and the vacuum stuff, but if you're vacuuming up, let's say plastic, if you're vacuuming other things that aren't, should you worry about that? Just dump the whole thing anyway, it's just gonna be trash or, like little pieces of plastic or whatever might get in my vacuum?
The question. Yeah, the question is, should you worry about other little things that might be in your vacuum, like pieces of plastic? If it's little enough to vacuum up, I wouldn't worry a lot about it because if you take your compost and you create it and then you start sifting it out, all those little pieces of plastic will sift out. And you'll end up with them and you can just throw them away at that time. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Jen?
I'm doing some container gardening this year for tomatoes, and I was planning on adding compost to the top, so I left some more of them when I planted them. But after hearing about compost tea, do you think that might be a better solution?
The question is compost tea better than putting compost in your planters? I don't think I can answer that. Either one's going to be really good. You might try a little bit of either. I put a lot of compost in my planters when I plant anything. And I find that because it holds water so well, much better than commercial potting soil. So I always add it in. And so I like to put compost into my planters that are going to be outside because of that. Okay, I'll show you one more thing. We've got a couple of minutes here because here's my weird thing. This falls under the category of things I do that make my neighbors think I'm crazy. Okay, here was my problem. I had this featherbed, queen size featherbed that was many years old that I was not using anymore, did not want it. These things are huge. They take up huge amounts of space. Wouldn't even fit in a trash can. So I started thought featherbeds are made of feathers. Those are organic. It's got a cotton on it. That's organic. I can compost this thing. Well, I wasn't going to cut it up and put it in my compost bin because that would have been a huge mess. That would have made some great slides, though. So instead, I had my bed, my annual flower bed, which finally we got a hard freeze in late October last year. So I cleared it off. And basically, I dug a grave for my feather bed about 4 or 5 inches deep. And I planted my feather bed in the garden. Don't laugh at me. And I did cut some slits in it to make sure that some moisture got into it because I was afraid the cotton cover would not let moisture in too well. And I covered it up. And it looked just like that. And I forgot it until this spring. Now, you might think I should have this great slide next that shows this abundant garden. But I discovered a couple of things. One is I should have started earlier in the year. This is a live and learn thing. When I dug down this spring, well, I did this Halloween. It was Halloween that I did this. If you remember, we had a really dry fall. And I had already put my hoses away for the fall, and I was not getting one out in order to water this featherbed. So I didn't. So it didn't get much composting done last fall, to say the least. So this spring, when I dug into it, I discovered the cotton was almost gone, but there was a layer of feathers. They had sort of compacted down and had not composted very well. So I did not plant anything great and beautiful there this year. I was hoping to have a tomato garden there, but that just didn't happen. I did plant some seeds there, and I should have had a nice picture of that, except that then we got a monster rainstorm, and the seeds sort of washed away. And so there's not much growing there yet, but it's there. The featherbed is there. I have confidence that this time next year, there will be beautiful things growing on top of my featherbed. So my point in showing you this is just be imaginative. You can keep things out of the landfill if you really want to just take a little bit of a risk and do something a little different. Maybe not this extreme, but just keep your mind open and think of ways to use this stuff in your landscape. Any other questions, comments? If not, thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Sherlyn. As she mentioned at some point in the presentation, the city is actually having a compost bin sale this Saturday. We've been holding one every June for the last few years, and I didn't bring a picture of the bin, but they're called Garden Saver Earth, and there was a press release that went out a while back. We don't have information on the landfill website, but it is on Facebook if you're interested in that, and there's a picture of them. They're basically 3 by 3 by 3. They kind of look like a Darth Vader helmet, so to kind of give you a general idea, they're like a black plastic cylindrical type. And they have a little door that opens up in the front and on the top, so you can turn stuff on the top and then open the front and get the compost out. We're selling them from 9 to 11 on Saturday morning at the East Side Fairway on Commerce Drive, and the price is $37. So obviously not essential to purchase a bin, but if you want to get started, an easy way to do it is to have one there. It keeps stuff tidy too. I speak from personal experience on this because I have 2 little dogs that like to dig in my pile if I don't contain it really well, so if that's a concern for you. But otherwise, thank you very much. And if you have any questions about the landfill compost, any more questions for Sherlyn, just let us know.
Okay, I have a picture of that.
Oh, great.
Compost, yeah.
Okay, so there's a photo of the compost bin, or the bins that we're selling this Saturday if anyone's interested in seeing that. Thank you.
There's some handouts over there.
Yes, yeah, we brought, there's a kind of the general overview of the presentation tonight, and then there's a compost about Iowa City Community Compost, which is what we make at the landfill. We're actually out right now until July 1st. And then there's a very general one about composting at home. So you're welcome to take those as well. Thank you all for coming tonight. Go ahead, ma'am.
You were talking about turning the compost. One of the ways that we have done the turning in ours is to run the tiller through it. And that aerates it and cuts it up some.
I need to elaborate a little bit. My compost bin is 5 feet wide with a chain link gate on it. And it's about 10 feet long. So I can open the gate, run the thrower through, close the gate. Lazy man.
Excellent. Excellent. The comment is about a compost bin that's 10 feet wide and 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. And to turn it, they just can run their tiller through it, which is great.
It's the lazy guy's way of doing it.
That's terrific.
In about 2 years, all I do is dig it all out and just put it in the garden until I'm done.
And you till it into the garden every couple of years. Excellent.
Well, thanks again, Sherlyn.
Thanks.